So, where does improv come from? We can date it back to ancient Greece in 600 before Christ, during Ditheram sung for Dionysus, and in 391 before Christ in Rome with the Attilan farce. At that time, there were topics you couldn't talk about, like military defeats or famines. But some artists found a workaround by including improvised parts to their plays in order to avoid censorship, yet it didn't stop the censors who required the text of their improvs.
Show me the text of your improv!
What? So, some troops had their subventions cut or were purely forbidden to play. A few centuries later, during the middle of the 16th century, you could see some improv with the Italian troops of the Commedia dell'arte. These troops were going from town to town playing with masks representing their character and using predefined structure of story including mandatory milestones between which they made up scenes. This format would be the format for a very long time. In the 17th century, people were making impromptus, improvised poems inspired by refined sentiments, a sophisticated idea, well, something spirited. Most of the time they are heard in the literary salon or at the king court to impress high society.
Madame la Marquise, you are so kind to me, love calls. Do you want to see my balls?
Well, it's more show-off than art. Molière wrote in Zadig that impromptu verses are only good for the lady they are addressed to. And by saying that, it kinda captured a lot of the attitude of the improvisers toward their audience. Buffon and Saint-Hilaire were renowned impromptu poets. There is such a prestige attached to the capacity to improvise poems that people started to cheat by preparing their verse in advance. This is called impromptu à loisir, but it's seen as a shameful thing to do. Much later, in the beginning of the 19th century, Charles Matthews, in his one-man show At Home, included improvised comedy acts. But it's only during the 1820s in Europe, thanks to the development of periodic newspaper, that literary improvisation, writing on the spot, would start to emerge as a real performance. Journalists must produce their articles faster and faster, therefore they must write on the spot without editing. But the real change in the history of improv happens in 1824, because during this year, poets improvisers, men and women, appear in Italy. They are called the
improvvisatori.
They perform in theaters, concert halls, or literary salons. Their show consists in asking themes to the audience, either verbally or by writing them on a piece of paper to be put in a bucket before a random draw. And we still do that! Well, except that back then they had a few minutes to prepare their poem. Nowadays we only have a few seconds. That's still amazing! The first famous improvisers emerged everywhere in Europe. Tommaso Gricci will inspire the poet Eugène de Pradel during a tour in Paris, the Dutch Willem de Klerk, the German Oskar Ludwig Bernhard Wolff. It's important to mention that in 1824 is the year of the death of Lord Byron, a major figure of the English poetry and of the Romanticism in general. And Lord Byron was famous for writing as fast as he was thinking. This is why the newspapers will talk about him in his obituary as a genius poet improviser. However, this is all experimental improv. There is no proper improv techniques. It won't be until the 1890s with Konstantin Sergeyevich Stanislavski, a great Russian drama teacher who uses improv in his teaching methods. We will get to know more about him later in other episodes, but quickly about Stanislavski. He co-founded the Moscow Art Theater, and his techniques were reused later in New York by the Actors Studio, which you may already know through the show Inside the Actors Studio. We call all these techniques the Stanislavski system. Later in 1913, improv is used as teaching methods by Jacques Copeau, the founder of the Theatre of the Vieux Colombier. Copeau was a massive rebel for his time. His idea is to teach methods that are completely different or in opposition with the conservatory. His work relies a lot on the commedia dell'arte and the mask that these actors used to wear at that time. It's the early 1900s, and it's also the time when a massive flow of migrants from Europe came to the US, some of which came with these ideas and techniques, especially since it was the progressist era which impacted a lot of the teaching methods. Improv starts to be used in the schools to teach theater to the kids. In 1946, Viola fucking Spolin, a major figure in improv theater from Chicago, created the Young Actors Company in Hollywood. She taught theater to kids of 6 years old and more through theater games. which would be the foundation of a whole new teaching method. But it's going to take her 20 years to codify all that and publish the very first improvisation manual in 1963. But before that, there will be a whole period of experimentation. In 1955, Spolin moves back to Chicago and keeps teaching improv to the actors who are going to found the Compass Players, the very first professional improvisers troupe. It is founded by David Shepard and Paul Seals, who is the son of Spolin. This troupe will foster great names like Mike Nichols, Ellen May, and Del Close. The origins are quite popular. The performances are done for low-class people. These improvisers are trained actors, directors, and writers from the University of Chicago. They propose to improvise new scenarios every week. More specifically, a writer prepares a few pages of scenario and the actors improvise between mandatory scenes, just like in the Commedia dell'arte. And at the end of the show, they ask a suggestion from the audience and make a complete scene up. And it works, even if it's in very small theaters where the actors sometimes also have to work as waiters. The Compass Players try their show in Broadway, but it doesn't work. It seems that being close to the audience is too important for this kind of show. Most importantly, people are not ready to pay that much for improv. Maybe because success is not guaranteed. Anyway, within the troupe, some of them think they can really go further and codify long-form improv. So in 1959, the Compass Players dies, but another troupe emerges, the Second City, still in Chicago, still existing today. These improvisers talk about spot improv to define what they do, which is a mix of semi-improvised scenes and scenes completely made up based on audience suggestions. This troupe has seen so many great actors. John Belushi, Bill Murray, Mac Myers, Steve Carell, Stephen Colbert, Nancy Walsh, Joel Murray, Bob Dendrick, Dan Aykroyd, Seven Darden, Barbara Harris, Melinda Dillon, Peter Boyle, Brian Doyle Murray, Harold Ramis, and also Del Close, who is considered as the founding father of modern improv and the one who has given it a prestigious name. In short, big guns. And I'm only talking about the Chicago school, but there will be second cities in Toronto, Las Vegas, Detroit, Cleveland. And many students of the second city will then found troupes throughout the US, such as the Comedy in 1963, in San Francisco, and many others during the following decades. So we talk a lot about Viola Spolin and her legacy, but I would like to remind you that in the 50s there was Dudley Riggs, who is known as the first comedian to use audience suggestions to improvise stand-up acts. At that time, improvisation was a word exclusively used for jazz, but newspaper will talk about word jazz to qualify his performances. Dudley Riggs will talk about instant theater. Later, he will then found the Instant Theater Company in New York. For the record, no theater wanted their show in the beginning, but they kept training in a room at the street level. The people walking by were so amazed by what they were doing that they started to pay to assist to their rehearsals. That's how everything started for them. Even the theater critics couldn't believe it was improvised. That's all I will say about Riggs.
So now we are in the 70s, and that's when one of the greatest names of improv will emerge, the British Keith Johnstone, who teaches in Canada at the Calgary University. He founded the Loose Mood Theatre in 1977 with Mel Tonkin. He will then publish two of the most important books of modern improv, Improvisation in the Theatre in 1979 and Improv for Storytellers 20 years later. We will get back to him in other episodes, but quickly, Keith Johnstone is so meaty. A bit like Jacques Copeau in his time. He says two things. Everything I learned in school is useless and limiting my potential, so I will teach the exact opposite. Also, he thinks that theater has become pretentious. He wants to make it accessible to anyone, especially those who think it's not for them. He wants to perform for people who prefer sports events and boxing, a bit like Shakespeare in his time. This is how he came up with the idea of combining theater and sport to create the theater sport.
Yeah, some hardcore thinking was put in the name.
And other formats like the Guerrilla Theater, the Maestro, or the Live Game. These formats create a competition between improvisers with the support of trained judges and lighting and sound improvisers.
His influence will be massive and still is today. And of course, a lot of great names will emerge from the Loose Mood Theatre.
The exact same year, on the 21st of October 1977, the National League of Improvisation is created in Quebec by an experimental troupe of Montreal. Gravel has invented with Yvon Leduc a format inspired by the hockey match.
Just like Keith Johnstone, the idea is to attract people by showing theater as a sport. So did one had the idea before the other? Did one inspire the other? I don't know, because Both formats were created the same year. Anyway, despite a rocky start, the improv match format will be a huge success.
In 1981, the National League will make its first tour in France and make the format popular.
Merci le Québec.
4 years later, in 1985, the National League will organize the first improvisation World Cup for French speakers, with troops from France, Switzerland and Belgium. Ravel will co-write with Jean-Marc Lavergne 2 important books, Impro Reflections and Analysis, and Impro 2 Exercises and Analysis.
I won't detail any further about the match because there will be an episode dedicated to that.
We are still in the 80s when Del Close of Second City and Shauna Halpern create together their own troupe, Improv Olympic or IO, in 1981. Once again we will retrieve great names already seen in the Second City, Mac Myers, Stephen Colbert, etc. It is from this troupe that one of the most popular formats of improv was born, the Harold, a long-form show coming from a lot of experimentation with the actors.
I won't go into details in this episode, but quickly, the Harold, from a suggestion of the audience, you create 3 stories which will then mingle.
Once again you understand the logic, this troupe will generate others. Del Close students will create later the Honorian Theater, near Chicago by the end of the 80s, and the Upright Citizens Brigade in 1990 in New York. And these troupes will have extensions in LA. I linger a bit on this because the 4 students of the Upright Citizens Brigade will then perform on the Comedy Channel from 1998 to 2000. There's a DVD of their performance where you can see some Harold. So if you're interested in the format, get the DVD. Once again, same thing. Many great names will go through this troupe, and a book will emerge in 2013. And even if I haven't seen anything about it, you can bet that many former members will create their own troupe or have already founded their own troupes. And voila! Today, improv is thousands of troupes all over the world. You have troupes in India, in China, in Tunisia, in Italy. They even organize international tournaments in the Philippines. The formats are more and more diverse. School of thoughts have emerged, with the school of thought mostly game-based, mostly coming from the work of Viola Spolin and her students, and a school more storytelling-oriented, mostly based on the work of Keith Johnston. It's a discipline. Okay, fine, I talk about it. Of course, I couldn't talk about the history of improv without talking about this humongous show that is Whose Line Is It Anyway? The show started on the radio in England and then was broadcast on TV in 1988. Then it stopped in 1999 and appeared the same year in the US. The show stopped in 2007 but started again in 2013. Whose Line consists in a few short games in front of a participating audience. The improvisers get points whatever way they can after each improv. But in Whose Line, points don't matter. And even though I love the show and admire the amazing talent of Colleen Mockery, Ryan Stiles, Wayne Brady, and the other regular players of the show, don't stop there. Go watch a live show, go see a match. There are even improvised one-man shows now. Go ahead, be demanding, but really there are good stuff out there. To conclude, we can say that the history of improv is quite young actually. At least younger than the history of cinema. We have only started to work on improv as a performance less than a century ago, and improv troupes have started to widespread only in the 70s, 80s. So there is still a lot to experiment on and a lot to discover. I was talking about the cinema before, and that maybe one day we will see improvised movies. Maybe. But as you have seen, it takes a lot of years of experimentations and the desire to break the codes in order to reinvent them. Thanks for watching this episode of Ex Machina. Don't hesitate to subscribe to the channel or share this video. Go watch some improv, or even better, do some. See you soon. Bye.